So how do we send data to the server? Well, we saw one method of doing this, and that was to use query parameters in the URL that we were sending to the server. And the server can extract the key value pairs that we're sending in that request from the URL. But query parameters don't always make sense as the mechanism for sending data to the server. So there's another mechanism that we can use to send data to the server, and that's through sending data in the body that we've talked about. So when we send a request message, we can associate a body with it that we would like to place data into. So we can have a body, and as we saw, we can have different MIME types for that body. But let's talk about the two most common MIME types that we're going to see in bodies of messages that we're sending to the server. If you've ever gone and filled out a form on the internet, you've probably used one of these body types, and that's the URL encoded form body type. And so what that is URL encoded is a body MIME type that tells the server that just like we did in the query parameters, we're going to have a set of key value pairs that are encoded exactly the same way as we would put them into the URL. But instead of putting those parameters into the query parameter part of a URL, we're instead going to take those key value pairs and put them into the body. So we can have URL encoded form data or data key value pairs that we're sending to the server. There's a second type of MIME type that we often see for bodies, and if you've ever uploaded a file through a form in your browser, you've probably used this MIME type, and that's multi-part encoded data. And what multi-part does is rather than using the typical URL encoding where we see a key equals a value, ampersand, another key equals a value, etc., and we have all the characters escaped, instead multi-part has a series of part separators that are expressed, and then we'll have data like byte data for the different parts. So basically we can build a message and we can express the different parts of that message using the multi-part encoding. So the body is broken into a series of parts, each of which can have its own identifier, so essentially its own key, and also its own MIME type so that we can interpret what to do with that part. So multi-part is typically used for uploading data like images or large amounts of data to the server, whereas URL encoded is typically used for sending simple key value pair sets to the data. Now you may be asking yourselves, well, when should I use one or the other? What is the rule? Well, there's the basic thing you need to consider is how much data you're sending to the server. Multi-part is good for sending a lot of data to the server. If you're sending a file to the server, you're uploading some large chunk of binary data, multi-part is the appropriate way to do that. If you're sending a series of simple key value pairs, URL encoded is the way to do it. And one of the reasons for that is that URL encoded is going to be more efficient, more space efficient in the size of the message for small amounts of data than a multi-part. And the reason is that if you have a series of short key value pairs, in a multi-part message, each one of those key value pairs has to be broken up and prefixed by a specific message indicator in the multi-part message. And when you add up all of the overhead of those various formatting rules for multi-part for small sets of key value pairs, it's less efficient than a URL encoded message. However, if you're sending a lot of data, multi-part is a much more efficient way of doing it than URL encoded because the URL encoding rules require a transformation of that data so that it meets the URL encoding rules, which ends up increasing the amount of data that we're actually sending to the server in order to safely express what we're sending to the server in a URL encoded way. So we can think of this for lots of data or binary data like files. And we can think of this as, small amounts of data or simple key value pairs. And when you're sending request messages, where you're sending data to the server, depending on how much data you're sending and sort of the characteristics of that data, you will choose a content type that's either URL encoded typically or multi-part. Now, when we get further into the course, we'll see that there's another type that commonly gets used and is popular now called application/JSON. But we'll talk about that type when we get to it later in the course. So how do we communicate these MIME types that are associated with the bodies of requests and responses? Well, this is where the headers in HTTP messages come into play. We need to provide meta information to either the client or the server, telling it how to interpret the body of the HTTP message. And this meta information gets communicated as the content type header in an HTTP message. And what the content type header says is this body of this message should be interpreted as a particular MIME type. So the content type communicates the MIME type that's that's associated with the body of either a request or a response. So we can use the content type header in both request messages and response messages that include a body. And so either end of the conversation can look at the HTTP content type header and then determine how the body should be interpreted. So we learned about headers before, and we saw that there were meta information that helped one end of the conversation to process or handle the message in some way. And in this case, this is a perfect example of how they're used. The content type is telling us the format of the body of a request or of a response, and how the server or the client should interpret that data.